Remember this song? What about this one? Well, in this video, I'm going to go over 5 video game theme songs that hit way harder than you remember. I'm going to explain the music theory as to why they're so epic. Let's go. And if you want to see something really insane, stick around for number 5. Video games have always been a part of my life. My mom and dad played some Mario on SNES when they were pregnant. That's maybe part of it. Over the years, I've adventured through so many different consoles like SNES, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, GameCube, PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and a bunch of other ones in between. But no era has quite had the same caliber of music than the old school era. One interesting feature about this era of music, often called chiptune, is that the limitation of the medium was a huge influence on the style of writing. In some cases, the composers only had 4 tracks to work with, so they had to get really creative to create larger pieces of harmony and really push the boundaries of that really tight constraint, which influenced their ability and what they did to write these amazing pieces. All right, let's start with number 1. I literally know this game like the back of my hand. All the secrets, all the levels, all the tricks. It was one of my all-time favorites that I played with my sister when I was like 7. And that game is Super Mario World, which was released in November 1990 in Japan and August 1991 in America. And the music for that game was written by the famous Koji Kondo, who wrote a lot of the famous scores for Nintendo, like Legend of Zelda, all the Mario themes, etc. Okay, so let's check out the castle or fortress theme that you find in this game. All right, so I have the MIDI for this song and all the future songs that we're going to explore in this video loaded up into Ableton so that we can isolate the different instruments, break it down, talk about it a little bit. And I also have my overhead with push, but I also have a nice little visual of a piano. Everyone else who doesn't play push that is more used to seeing that, I have it as well, right? So to start off, this piece is in F minor, right? So if I go ahead and play this F minor chord on push, you can also see it up there, right? It sounds like this. Okay, so that's the vibe we're dealing with. All right, and this song actually has a lot of complex melodic and chordal relationships, specifically in the chord complexity and the melodic complexity and the tension that you see between the melody and the progressions that you find in here, right? So this tune has a lot going on for it, and it has a lot of interesting transitions between the chords and the melodies and the different sections of this piece, okay? And a key feature of the song is the reinterpretation and recontextualization of the melody as it changes, okay? It starts off at almost half speed, and then each iteration kind of takes about 20 seconds, and you'll see how it develops over time. All right, let's go ahead and start with the intro, and I'll move over here so we can see some of the action here on push. So let's play it. All right, so we got the vibe of that intro. And first of all, let's talk about what's going on with the chords. All right, so the first thing to point out about this tune is how it starts off with this weird snaky diminished run. I'll press play and you'll see it crawl up the push too here. Right, so we have this like, right, this kind of crazy shape. Right, goes higher up. So this is really a lot of dissonance, right? This brings in a lot of tension, a lot of mystery, and really brings us in. It's like, oh my God, we're somewhere that we don't know, and it's kind of scary, right? Then we get into the actual intro, which I'll play it for a sec. Then the melody comes in. All right, so the first thing to look at in this intro is it's pretty simple, but it's an interesting relationship between the parts that are happening. So first off, we just have a bass sound that's just anchoring us right to our root note, doing that simple, right? F to G, right? Very simple, keeping us well acquainted in this like F minor tonality. And then on top of that, we have these really interesting chords going on, which is simply this chord, right? This like C with a 4 on top to this B minor 9 type thing, and then going up chromatically back up to C and then back down. And this is what makes this interesting, is the bass underneath kind of fills that out to a bigger chord, right? Then we go up in the bass and we move up to this minor shape, which actually gives us this kind of major chord, right? With this major triad between the G and the bottom of this B here, right? And then going up, the chord goes up here, but the bass doesn't move, but it implies this kind of shape in the bass and then back down, right? So let's play that all together. Right, gives a spooky vibe for shizzle. Then the main melody comes in. Right, it's pretty simple, but what's interesting about this is here's our root note. Starts on the 3rd, falls back down to the root, but then immediately goes to the 5th, and then that major 6th, right? Okay, and one thing to notice about this melody is that it's kind of an inverted motif, right? So if I go ahead and play it, you'll notice that the rhythm is like ding, ding, 1, 2, 3. So it's like 2 longer notes and then 3 shorter notes, and then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, right? So it's kind of an inverted motif, but it has the same kind of rhythmic cadence or contour, right? So if I play this, notice the timing. It's like 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So just this really cool inverted motif, very small detail, but I think that's what makes this melody recognizable and easy for your brain to latch onto. Right, really cool. And just this section in general really feels grueling, right? Like something is coming. You start off this mysterious, diminished, like arpeggio run, where am I? And then now you kind of definitely feel like something is coming, which is the perfect kind of mood for a castle theme, right? Where there's an enemy in this castle and, okay, I know there's something going on in here, but I don't know what's going to happen, right? That kind of uncertainty comes up. So the last thing I want to talk about when looking at this intro is just if we take elements from the melody, those harmonic chords happening, and then the bass line, we get a better picture as to what's kind of happening harmonically here. And it's really cool. So we start off with like this F minor triad, which is simple, but the bass implies like more of a C, right? Which just makes a really interesting chord. It's like F minor over C, cool. And then we move down to the root note. So then it's a lot more stable. So we start off, right? Then we move up to B with a diminished triad, right? So we move from here, right? And this diminished triad on B here, right, doesn't actually come from our F minor scale. If we look at F minor, there's no tritone in F minor, right? So we're actually borrowing that from somewhere else, right? You could see it as the 7th note in C major has a B diminished, right? There's a lot of ways you could look at where we're borrowing it from. So the second time through, once again, F minor, C in the bass. Then we move down to F in the bass, but then we move down to this D in the bass, okay? With this diminished shape. So straight up D diminished chord. And then we move this chord to having almost like that B diminished triad, right? But this more open sound with this minor 6 interval here, right? So altogether, it really creates a really cool pull of harmony that's definitely spooky and throwing in some of those diminished triads as part of the main harmony, right? So we start off here, diminished, and then we go here down to D diminished, and then we go back up here for the last chord. And the last thing I want to say about this progression in the intro is the tension and release that happens with the last chord going back to the beginning. Is we have this D in the bass, right? This kind of like dominant function, this dominant thing. Then we resolve back down to, right? So we go from tension, release, right? Tension, release. But the funny thing about this is that our like release chord isn't completely released. Like this still has some tension in it until we get back to, right? That's a lot more stable than with the C in the bass. So again, it's like creating a lot of tension, but then resolving to there's still tension going on, which fits this tune perfectly. The next section in this tune is what I call the dun dun section, where everything is playing in unison with this bass motif, right? So let's play it. Right, so major transition, call and response, ding, ding, 1, 2, call and response, right? Epicness, and then we finally introduce that dan, 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 na, na, some chromaticism there in the bass. If we go over here, right, we had always been going in the bass, but that last time we're going, right, we're doing that chromatic movement in the bass. Definitely introducing a new section. And then we have this crazy arpeggio, which I'll show you in just a sec. So check out this pretty dumb transition. So there's this really quick transition that brings us into what I would call the main section. The tempo goes up, the energy goes up. It's like, holy man, something is happening. That quick transition looks like this. And that brings us into the next section. Okay, so the first thing to notice about this section is the crazy arpeggios. Like, check these out. And I told myself that I might be able to play this on push and or guitar, and that would be badass, but not so sure about that. Check these out. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. The first thing to notice is that we are at a faster tempo. So after that transition, things speed up, right? Heartbeats going up, you know what I mean? Now something really evil is happening in this fortress, okay? And we have a more active bass line, and obviously what steals your focus is these crazy arpeggios. So let me go ahead and solo them, and let's talk about them a little bit. Right? So crazy lightning fast. Like, to try and play that, it's like patterns of 3. It's that, but super, super fast. I can't even do it. Good luck, right? Yeah, so probably a computer playing that for a reason. The first of those crazy arpeggios starts with this kind of minor shape, right? We have a C minor chord over G in the bass, right? If we take off this, that's just a C minor chord basically. Okay, so we're again, here's your minor triad, and then we have an octave here, and then another octave here. Okay, so nothing crazy here, just C minor going on in the first one. Let's look at the second arpeggio. Right, so we have this definite diminished vibe here, right? You can see it as C diminished, or we got this A in the bass. If we take off the A, diminished, just rapid fire. Super fast going through that. Okay, let's move on to the third one. Right, this one's interesting. Right, we got this kind of interesting extension. F minor over A, if we take this off, just F minor over C. If we take the C off, just an F minor chord. Right? So again, nothing complicated. It's really just an F minor chord, but with the C and that A flat in the bass, right? Going through this arpeggio. And then finally, let's go to the last one, right? Then we have this diminished shape once again, be diminished. So again, it's kind of moving through that same progression that we saw earlier, oscillating between a more minor sound, right? This C minor, then we're going to that diminished voice, right? Then we're going to something a little bit more stable with the F sound, right? Over here, this F minor, and then we're finishing off with that B diminish, right? This kind of thing. So again, there's tension and release within these arpeggios. They're rapid fire, they're super fast, taking the attention, but it's going from a minor tonality into diminished, into minor, into diminished. So there again, there's tension and release going on there. The next thing to point out with this section is the bass part, right? So let's go ahead and solo the bass. Then we have a second bass layer. Right? So definitely a crazier bass rhythm, especially contrasted to the earlier section, which was just 2 notes. This is like steady bass. And the bass is actually has an interesting movement where it's starts on the C, right? So we're kind of like anchoring towards C more so in this section, still in the key of F minor, but we're starting on C. Then we're going up to this tritone, which in F would be your, diminished 2, that minor second, then down to F, right? Then up to G, and then back down to C. So that's kind of what the root movement is happening with the bass. And then once the second bass layer kicks in, there's that kind of like octave slidey thing going on. Right underneath those crazy arpeggios. What's interesting here is that we come back into that main melody, but now there's much more active bass, and there's those crazy arpeggios going on in the background. So it's a lot more chaotic. But if we listen to this main melody, it is the same motif and essentially the same melody with some cool harmony going on, right? So let's give that a listen. Right? So just the bass and the harmony together, we solo that. This is what's going on in the background. Right? Then we bring in this. Right? Pretty damn intense if you ask me, right? And now let's zoom into this melody and check it out. So the way he harmonized the main melody is pretty crazy. So I'll play it for you soloed and you can see what's happening, right? Right? So we have some really interesting voice leading and he's somehow making that tritone melodic, right? So if we play this, right, we got this like movement in the bass. G to E flat, G, E flat, right? Then if we continue, right, we have this tritone and then moving up the tritone higher, making this voice leading, right? Very interesting. Right, and then hitting that straight dissonance between the G, right? Right, we're hitting that as a harmony, that minor second. A lot of dissonance in this harmonization of the main melody, but notice how the motif is exactly the same and the movement is exactly the same as the melody that we heard earlier in the tune, right? Same rhythmic timing, same kind of contour, but now this really haunting and interesting harmonization really creating some dissonance. All right, and finally, the second time we come back to this crazy riff that the focus is on the melody with those crazy arpeggios on the back, we lead into what I would say is the climax of this tune, where there's an interesting counterpoint, okay, going on with the melody, and there's a lot of movement. And just look at this at a glance. Okay, this is the chords that are happening in this section. We won't break them all down, but just know that there's a lot of interesting tension and release that's happening between the voicing and the harmonization of the melody, as well as the new chords that are introduced. All right, so I'll play it from here and we'll lead it into the next section so you can hear it. Epic, right? That's talk about a climax of a tune right here. So there's a few things I want to break down for you. The first thing we'll look at is the new chords that these arpeggios hit, since it's kind of acting like the major harmonic driver. All right, so this last climax section is amazing. So let's break down what's happening with the bass and the harmony. Then we'll check out the melody on top. And it really, truly is beautiful and definitely the climax of this tune. All right, so let's break down the first half of these chords going into the second. So the first kind of arpeggio is around this C minor vibe. And fun fact, if you put the sixth degree of a minor scale, so C minor in this case, right, this minor 6, if you put that in the bass underneath this C triad, you get this real nice A flat major 7 kind of voice, right? Right? So that kind of introduces that romantic feel, a little bit of beauty, still some sadness, but really nice touch for that climax. You know, it's Bowser's castle. He's trying to steal the princess for some sort of weird twisted love thing. So maybe there's some beauty in there, right? And then so there is your first kind of harmony. Then we move down to this B diminished, but we have the D in the bass, which is the minor third of the chord, right? Which is a nice move, right? Going from down to here. Then we move into straight up G major, and then we resolve down to C minor, right? So that creates a lot of tension as well. So it's kind of like this descending thing, C minor with the A flat in the bass into B diminished, D in the bass. Then we move up to G major, and then we move down to C, right? So it's like a nice downward movement, and G major naturally wants to resolve kind of down to C, right? Especially if you start introducing that flat 7, right? Down to huge sense of resolve there. So I'll play you these first 4 chords so you can hear it. So let's play it. All right, so let's start. Here's the C minor, B diminished, G, C minor, right? So there's our first 4 chords, and let's move on to the second 4 chords. All right, so for the second half of the chords for the climax, right away we go to this C diminished sound, right? So that's what the arpeggio is based off, right? And this is coming from just landing on C minor. So then we go to this diminished sound, right? So just basically pivoting with C and then now introducing that diminished voice, right? Then we move on to this D major sound with an F sharp in the bass, right? Which colors it nicely. Then we kind of stay here, still D minor, but then we go to D in the bass, which stabilizes it. And then finally, we move up to this really nice final chord. So here's our C diminished run, D major, right? And then finishing with this crazy run at the end. Right, and then we get dropped back into the main motif. But let's cover that last chord here. Right, and then that last chord has some really nice extensions, G in the bass, right? And then we're playing up this C minor shape, but when then we're adding these extensions, right? Right, the add 4, add 11 with G in the bass, this really nice, dramatic, colorful, slightly jazzy chord, open sound, right? So altogether, that climax, pretty damn epic. So the harmony in this final climax is beautiful, and this is where you can start to take this, reinterpret it, use it with your own music, whatever you want to do. But let me play through the whole resolution of this chord progression. So we start off with this C minor with the A flat in the bass, giving us this major 7 sound. Then we move down to this B diminished, D in the bass, right? That's nice by itself, right? Then we move on to this G major, resolving to C minor. Then we go to C diminished, right? Down to D major with the F sharp here. Then we go to D, and then we resolve, right? Beautiful progression. That's a spicy meatball Mario. All right. So the next game on our list is Super Bomberman 2, which was released in April 1994. And the composer for the music of this game is Yasuhiko Fukuda. And I'm probably mispronouncing that. Apologies. So this game I actually didn't play at all growing up, but I came back to it and discovered it when I went through my I'm going to collect SNES games phase. And this is actually the background music for World 1, and it's pretty dang bonkers. One thing to point out about this tune is how progressive it is in general. So if we look at the structure of the tune inside of Ableton here, right, we have this quick little intro, which is insane. We'll look at that in a sec. And then we have this A section that lasts for this amount of time. Then we have a bridge and a build that brings us into then a new section, right? Then we have another kind of bridge and build that leads us into a third section. And then we have this cool riff that kind of like transitions us into this LOL section and then back home, right? So it's kind of this like long progressive journey from the beginning up until this point where nothing is really repeating. There are some familiar motifs and similarities, but it is kind of like this crazy adventure that brings us from the beginning all the way to here. And then the main section A repeats itself once again. So it essentially progresses through 3 main sections, each with their own build and or transitions in between them. All right, so let's go ahead and check this out. Let's go to the overhead. And I just want you to check out this crazy arpeggio that starts off this tune. And if one thing video game composers from this era knew, it was how to start a song. So check out this craziness that starts this off. I'll play that again for you. Let's find it. Craziness. Let's play it again. Pretty nuts, right? So listen to those art bros. So here is this arpeggio in this intro, right? What is actually going on here? Well, we are playing really quick, this kind of sus voicing, right? So if we play it, right, we're kind of using this root note, right? Which I would say we're in safely in A major and kind of anchoring on that flat 7, right? So maybe more of a mixolydian type sound, right? But definitely A is the root. So it starts on the root and it kind of does this shape where we're hitting the root, hitting that perfect 4th, perfect 5th, back to the root, then yet again going up, right? The 4th and then this 5th octave again. So it's kind of like this sus4 stack. So it's just like root, 4th, 5th, root, 4th, 5th, root, right? Upwards. And then maybe a few other colorful extensions on top of that, right? And just lightning fast. Like this is definitely computer music. It would be almost impossible to play this, especially on push. You might be able to get away with it on guitar with like crazy fast tapping. This would be something I would maybe try to learn when I was like 17. But now I'm like, I'll let the computer do it, right? So let's check this out, right? Let's solo this. All right, so what is actually going on here in terms of the rhythm? We are actually playing 30-second notes, but triplet divisions, right? So here, if I go to the triplet grid, right, in 30-second notes, and I kind of go back and forth, right, we can see this arpeggio kind of climb up push, right, which is cool. So that's what's happening, but super fast, right? With that 3 timing, triplet timing, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's kind of the whole motif that brings us in. Craziness. I have a feeling that playing these video games when I was a child had a big influence on how much I like really fast riffs and crazy stuff in general. Because if we look at this, you'll see it's crazy. All right, so let's talk about section A, which is the main section. I'll play it for you and then we'll break some of it down, all right? All right, so we got the vibe. So the first thing to point out about this section is it has a super sick groove, bass line, and swing to it, right? It definitely has a swing that gives it that funky feel, right? It's like a glitch hop tune, but in 1994. And the harmony of this tune is a lot more straightforward than what we looked at in the past, right? But listen closely to all of this interesting counterpoint and counter melodies. There's literally always something going on, and there's a lot of rhythmic call and response and syncopation between the bass and the main funky motifs in the background. All right, so I'm going to start to isolate some of these things so that we can hear them differently, right? So when we start off, we have this bass that's kind of anchoring us, right, to this funky groove. Right? So if we look at this closer, I'll just bring this up, right? Like you can see there's a ton of syncopation going on between just these 2 bass riffs, right? So let's just check out one of them. This is the more basic one. right? So if we're counting this in a 4, right, a lot of the accents are landing on the offbeats, right, which gives it that funky feel, right? So if we look here, right, this is your downbeats right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see that there's a lot of accents happening. Specifically, when the bass goes a little higher in pitch and is doing an accent, it's kind of accenting the the riff at a part that's an offbeat, right? So if I put on the click here, you'll see that it kind of emphasizes parts of the offbeat that are outside of when the click is happening. Right? So pretty cool riff, very funky, right? And then the other bass part. Super syncopated, right? And notice how the second bass part is quite simple compared to the first one, but together it creates this collage of funkiness, right? Right, so this is like the foundation that we're building the rest of this tune on top of. All right, next I want to kind of emphasize how many different layers there are in this tune, right? If we look back to the Mario Castle theme, it was pretty simple in terms of layers, right? There wasn't that many layers, but the harmony was super complex, right? The way that those layers interacted. And this one, I would say that the harmonies may be a little bit more straightforward, but look at the sheer amount of layers that are going on here, right? This is like an orchestra, but 8-bit to be this funky background music for you dropping bombs on innocent animals, I'm guessing, right? But like, check this out. Like, this is the main melody here. Notice how syncopated it is. So very simple, right? And it's just like this funky motif, definitely got a swing, definitely syncopated as well. We throw in the bass. Now we're starting to build the foundation for this whole tune. Right, so that's your main motif. That's kind of what's going to be stuck in your head, right? As the melody kind of sings on top of that. Let's bring in this other layer, which I think is doing the same thing on the other side. Okay, so I think it's actually doing a harmony. So let's check this out. We have this main melody and then another one on the other side. All right, they're doing very much the same thing rhythmically, but this other layer, right? Same exact rhythm, but harmonizing or just basically supporting the main melody, right? Because definitely the higher motif here is what you hear more when these two are playing together. Okay, so now we have these two layers that are harmonizing, and then we have these two layers in the bass that are harmonizing. All right, and then on top of that, they add in a lot of counterpoint, right? And other things that are kind of, swooping in and keeping things interesting. So for example, this crazy riff, we'll bring this in and notice how this adds to the rest of the group. Right, this crazy riff, let's play it again. Right, what is that? We gotta check that out. And then over here we have another riff. Right, this like chromatic passage. It's probably a little bit more in the background, but let's actually check out what's going on with this one. Let's solo it, right? And let's check out what's going on, see if we can get it on push. Right, so this is just one example of so many of these types of embellishments that happen in the song, and check it out what's happening on the MIDI and on push here, right? This cool kind of like descending suspended motif, again, similar to the intro. Play it again. We'll solo it. Right? Very cool. And we kind of have this descending motif moving downwards, like then they hit a chord. So on and so forth. So it's kind of doubling up, hitting chords every other time, right? So really cool embellishment, especially when you're looking at the rest of the piece, right? And when it comes in. Right? And even before that, there's another motif that happens right here on this other track, right? Let's check this out. Right? Again, it's kind of that similar type of vibe. I'm guessing it's kind of a suspended sound, Right, so you'll see these all over this piece, these kind of like counter melodies, counter rhythmic motifs that happen all over the place to just keep things interesting and obviously keep the energy super high, which is a huge theme of this song. So I've soloed this one, this is what it sounds like. Right, if we look at push, we have this kind of like climbing again, suspended, right, super simple, root fifth, right back here. So that kind of motif happening again and again. Here's another one. If we go over here, right? Very cool. I don't know if you could physically play that. Right? So we're just kind of doing these almost pentatonic, you know, dyads moving up and down. So here's everything kind of all together before the main melody really roots itself, right? So it's just kind of bringing in the song and really stimulating us, right? There's a lot going on. So I'm just going to isolate the main motifs as well as those counter motifs, right? So you can hear what's going on. All right, so let's check out this main melody that happens in the main section of this tune. So let me solo it and I'll play it for you. Right? So very funky, a lot of chromatic movement there. And again, this is really outlining kind of a Mixolydian vibe, an A Mixolydian, where we're hitting this flat 7 instead of the major 7 that you would find in a normal major scale, right? So it gives it kind of that funky, psychedelic, bluesy kind of feel. And then in this run, we have some chromatic, right? Some chromatic run that happens in there, right? So now on top of the rest of the music, notice how this one is really falling on the beat, except for those chromatic passages that kind of like, you know, match all the other things going on, right? So this one's a lot more on the nose while everything else is kind of doing a lot of syncopation around it. So let me play it with everything else. Right? Call and response going on with those main motifs. And underneath this main melody, there's basically another melody happening that's simply playing a fourth, right, below the main melody, right? So again, there's that theme of perfect fourths kind of reoccurring in all of the main melodies here and all the motifs and all the runs. So here's what they sound like together. Jolly good time. All right, so after that main section, we move into this kind of bridge section that definitely is moving somewhere, right? It's creating tension. It's like, okay, we're moving somewhere else. So I'll play it for you and we'll break a little bit of it down. And then we get into the next section, which I'm calling section B. So let's break this down a bit. So it seems like there's a lot going on here, but it's actually pretty simple. So the first thing to notice is that we're kind of departing away from this A Mixolydian kind of vibe, right? And we're immediately starting with a B flat major, right? So it's kind of chromatic movement where we're jamming around here and then out of nowhere, we're starting with this chord. Then we're moving on to C major, right? Then we're doing these inversions. So basically, right, F over here to G, right? And then up here to A major, right? So then we're back to our root note. But notice how there's this like interesting, almost whole tone chromatic movement that's really creating this tension. Okay, so here's what the new chord progression looks like. Over and over again, right? So again, that B flat major chord is one step higher than our root note here, but then we resolve to this chord, which is essentially the higher part of an A major chord, which is our root note. So we resolve to the roots. It still feels familiar, but now there's this chromatic passage that happens. And then these other elements that are happening, if we go back over here, right, we have like this crazy riff going on. And all that's doing is arpeggios of those same chords that I just showed you, right? So if I go back here, all that's doing is hitting these arpeggios of these chords in cool, interesting ways. as we're moving through those new chords. And then finally, we get to this little build section that's like has some chromatic movement. Right? And it's kind of the same thing where there's arpeggios happening. If we go over here, there's a very simple octave that's moving with those chromatic chords. So if I go back to my hands and I show you this melody is simply, right? So it's like 2 half steps and then a whole step. So that there's some chromatic movement. And then we end here. And all that's happening with these other arpeggio layers is that they are doing octaves of that same movement. Right, so we're kind of looking at the melody of this part, right? We have a kind of repeating octave shape that's moving in that chromatic movement that I just showed you. And then we have this more active kind of melodic passage that's leading the ear into the next section. So that's what they sound like together. Again, super syncopated. And then if we look at just the octave displacement here, so it looks like this. Right, if I go up an octave, it's pretty simple. Going up in octaves with those same chord tones. So essentially this is just hitting those octaves of those same chords. And then we have that more advanced melody. So here's what this main melody is kind of doing during that chromatic chord passage. I'll solo it. Right, so there's some beautiful movement here. We're doing this like E flat major, right? But we're adding in that second. Then we're moving down here to the F over 8, which has some chromatic movement, right? To match that chromatic bass. Then we move down and we're hitting this same note, but an octave lower. Just like a simple chord, power chord. And then we move up here to A flat. So that's a really interesting progression. It's a lot of movement in it, right? We've got this E flat major with the 2. Add 2, that's beautiful. Down here, right? So some really energetic movement matching those chords. And in this case, instead of playing the chords, since again, a lot of the limitations of this chiptune kind of music is that you can't really be playing multi-voice chords. You got to get creative with the arpeggios to outline that kind of harmony, because you are limited to how many voices you have. So that's why they do these super fast passages. All right, so next we go into this next main section that has a little bit of a different flavor. It's a little bit more bluesy, a little bit more straight ahead, but still has that swing and still has a lot of familiar elements in the melody, in the counterpoint, etc. I'll play it for you, then we'll break some of it down. Right, so it's something familiar, but again, it's different. And again, that points towards the progressive nature of this tune. But the first thing I want to zoom in on is just the bass, right? So we have kind of a more straight ahead bass motif here. So what the bass is doing during this new section is pretty simple if you don't include all the syncopation and like embellishments, but essentially we're anchoring at A and then we're going down to G, down to E, back up to A, right? Very kind of bluesy sound. Right? Again, with the root and that minor 7th, right? Giving us that kind of Mixolydian vibe. So the interesting about this bass riff, although it's pretty simple in terms of the harmonic movement, is that it jumps the gun rhythmically and restarts on the 4 count instead of on the 1, right? So if I play this riff and I count through, notice how it restarts when I say 4 instead of 1, which is abnormal. It kind of jumps the gun, which kind of hints towards this even being more progressive, right? So let's give that a go, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So it kind of jumps the gun, right? It has that extra bar of space before we go into it, right? And kind of gives us that forward momentum and that kind of like chaotic, you don't know what's happening in this tune. Next, let's focus on the melody in this section, which essentially has the same motif as the melody earlier, right? It really lands on those downbeats, but embellishes a little bit of chromaticism and more flourishes of notes for that syncopation. And it essentially follows a similar contour. It's a little different. So it's kind of like a variation on that initial melody, which is over here. Right, if I play you this one, this is the first melody. right? And then this is the variation. Right? A little bit of a different rhythm, but it's still landing on those downbeats. And again, it's resolving on the same note, right? And then the second variation. Right? Again, so progressing that idea a little bit further, but still leaving enough commonality that we kind of recognize it as being like, oh yeah, that's kind of the same melody as I heard before. And then finally, I just want to highlight this hilarious bluesy lick that starts on the end, right? On the off beat, and just like accentuating these hilarious little things. So this is what it sounds like. How cute is that, right? So it's super, super simple, just hitting these notes. A little bit of chromaticism and then going down. Same shape. But the interesting thing about this is that it lands on the end. So it's like one and. So it's accenting all the ands, which makes it super syncopated and funky. And then this kind of just super bluesy, right? So just adding that in the background. Let's play it all together with everything. Right? It's like a cacophony of awesomeness. Moving on. All right, so this next section, again, is a different bridge with a different build into the next section, which is section C. So again, hinting towards the progressive nature of this tune, but one commonality that this bridge and this build has is that earlier in the tune, this bridge and this build have very much the same functions, right? So if we look here, we have this crazy riff doing arpeggios matching these chords, right? Over here in the second bridge, we have this other crazy arpeggio that's matching these chords. And then we have more of a straight ahead chromatic movement. Same thing here, right? We're during this build, we got this chromatic movement with, you know, chords without the arpeggios. So they're serving the same function, right? And to my ears anyway, it's like I recognize this part, even though a lot of it is different, as being the same function as what happened earlier. It's like, okay, we're going for another ride, and it's like craziness, and then we're going to build into another thing, which we've already experienced. So although this is, again, progressive, and this is a good learning tool for how to write progressive music, but it's like the functions of these sections, we've already experienced those, and those are familiar to us, even though the parts might be different. All right, so let me go ahead and play this for you so you can hear what's happening. Right, and then we get to a third section, right? So let's break down some of what's happening here. All right, so the first thing to point out here is that the bass is doing something a little different than it was before, but it's kind of the same rhythmic shape that was happening before, right? Before we were kind of just moving chromatically. That's what it sounded like before. Right, moving up with that chromatic movement. But now we're kind of anchoring more so on this G and moving up to the A sharp or the G flat, right? Where it's actually half a step higher than our root note. So this is actually starting to feel a little bit more chromatic, and we're maybe anchoring ourselves more towards G, right? And then introducing this tone. So similar to that other section, it's like, okay, we're introducing some chromaticism, borrowing chords, venturing outside of our A Mixolydian vibe. So check out what it's doing. It's super simple. Right, just hanging out here and then moving up over here. Super simple. Now, if we move on to checking out some of what else is happening, right? We have this melody doing some pretty cool chords. Right, introducing a little bit of dissonance, but notice how this is moving very in a similar way to the bass, right? Right, introducing some dissonance. And then we have these two main melodies that come in that are kind of grounding us to the similar motif. Right, so all together. So all of these parts are essentially moving together, right? But now we have all the counter melodic elements, which we have this crazy riff, and then we also have this other crazy riff. So these together and this thing. So let's listen to these together. So let me show you what that kind of crazy arpeggio looks and sounds like. Although it looks crazy, it's essentially just doing some chromatic movement. So it's starting off like this kind of shape, right? This major shape, and then just moving that up here, right? And just doing an arpeggio around that for the first two chords. And this next section, which is kind of a build, right? The bass is doing something very simple, kind of anchoring us more to C, and then going major second to the minor third, back down, and then going that chromatic step up from the major third. So it sounds like this. Right, so a little bit of chromatic movement at the end there, and then we have these chords harmonizing with it essentially the whole time, and it has a very specific rhythm, da 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 da, right? So those guys are matching up, and then we have this crazy kind of I don't even know how to describe this, but it sounds like this. Right? Just like these really cool back and forth chords really quick. And one thing to point out is if I put the metronome back on, notice how these land on the and again. Right? So they all kind of start on that offbeat, right? Creating that syncopation. All right, so let's zoom into this guy a little bit more. It's pretty crazy. This is what it sounds like. So again, it's just moving with how the bass is moving motif-wise. So at least for the first variation of this, and it's just moving in tandem with those chords, it starts off with this kind of shape, right? And then it goes over here. And it does that super, super fast. So it's like, which is like beyond what you could physically play, but that's what's going on really, really fast. Right, so you can see that there's some interesting internal movement in the voices and voice leading a little bit, but that's really the focus of this whole section. If we go back to seeing everything, right, and we listen, it's definitely leading our ear. All right, let's move on to the next section. So the C section of this tune. So again, progressive as hell. The first thing to notice here is that we've actually seen this bass motif before. Right? A to G, back down to E, back up to A. So we've seen that motif before. We have this other layer on the bass. Right? So we have this new climb up that they've added, right? Nothing crazy, just like a different motif to lead us back into it. And this other bass layer is essentially harmonizing with this other bass layer, right? Doing some syncopation as always, right? With this tune, doing the offbeats. And again, we have this similar motif coming in. A call and response between these two melodies. But again, like this melody is similar to our melody that we had over here. So again, it's a different motif, and this one has some different melody, some different notes, and a little bit different rhythm, but it is very much the same style, and it's a little bit more of an arrival vibe. It's like, yay, we made it somewhere, right? And then we have these things going on as well. Right, so a lot of swing on these motifs, especially this one. Right, a lot of swing kind of motion going on. And again, these are just kind of doing arpeggios that are going to be matching what's going on with this bass. So notice how these main melodies and these main motifs is kind of like a style of this composer, at least for this game, is that it's really matching up with how the bass is moving. And then we have these arpeggios that are outlining the chord shape, again, similar as before, that are just matching the rhythm of the bass, right? So if we play these together. Right, and it has kind of that same like chromatic movement that we've introduced earlier in the video. So if we look at this arpeggio run in a little bit more detail, it's kind of just doing inversions of the same chord for the first three and then moving down to a different chord for the last kind of riff, right? So let's play this. And then there's a call and response with the other thing. But essentially what's happening here is, right, this A chord and then moving the bass down. And then moving the bass down again, right? And then we go to this G over B kind of sound, right? So that's essentially what's happening for this run. And then the counter motif that moves with the bass, so on and so forth. All right, so let's check out this badass, just chromatic descending light, like typical, like swiping your hand down the piano, right? Which is very bluesy, in my opinion. That's what it sounds like. Right? Just bringing us back to the top with a lot of push. And then finally, we have this crazy kind of lead line brings us in back to the top. Sounds like this. Hilarious. And what's actually happening here is, well, that first riff. So for this first part of the riff, right, essentially we're doing some E pentatonic stuff. Right? And adding that kind of like blue note, which is very bluesy in between for some embellishment. And then the second half of this is just nonsense. Like that's just chromatic. But robotically fast. Right? That's hilarious. And then this crazy run. Right? Almost a sweep pick going up. Right? So we have that like bluesy. Right? So if I start highlighting some of these notes, you can see the chromaticism that's kind of bluesy, right? And then resolving up to there. And then going down is just a chromatic run, similar to the bass, but just faster. Right? Just going down the notes. All right, let's move on to our third game, which is Mega Man Battle Network 2, which was released December 14th, 2001. And the score was written by Yoshino Aoki. Now, growing up, I was tight with my cousin, and we still are. He's like my best friend forever, you know what I'm saying? And when we were growing up, we were 2 months apart and would only see each other only once a year during summer, since he lived outside of the city that I lived in, which is Winnipeg, and he was in like Vancouver, Yellowknife, Montreal. He moved all over the place. Now, when me and my cousin would hang, we would go hard. I remember convincing his parents to push back their flights back home by a week, many years in a row. I remember us both having started playing this game before the internet and instant communication was a thing. And we were both like, what? You're also playing the same game as me? And several 3 a.m. game session ensued from there. Okay. And one thing that I really love about the music for this series is how many nods it makes to the original Mega Man games. I believe that the composer also worked on Mega Man X3, which was an earlier installation in the whole Mega Man universe. So he was already familiar with the Mega Man motifs. So this game actually got re-released as a bundle with all of the different versions, Mega Man Battle Network 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all bundled together on Switch. If you haven't checked it out, definitely worth a shot. It's so fun and the music is epic. So the first thing I want to point out in this track is how much of a bass focus this theme has, which gives it overall a lot more energy, right? A lot more modern movement, which really fits the Mega Man vibe because everything in Mega Man is like balls deep, 100%, let's go, right? Like you're hunting viruses, it's like crazy internet, a lot of stuff going on, right? So it definitely gives it the Mega Man vibe and definitely has some major cojones, know what I'm saying? So let's go ahead and check out some of this tune and break down a little bit what's happening. So let's play it from the start. Sounds like this. All right, so you can notice how much more rhythm and bass focused it is, right? It's a lot more modern in terms of its production and its feel because it was a Game Boy Advance game versus SNES, right? And one thing that I want to point out is like this is a boss battle theme, right? So again, this has to have high energy. It has to have stakes. It has to have unexpectedness because you're facing a major foe, right? So it's a challenge to surmount in the video game. And usually you'll notice this, that boss themes, right? Any significant event in a video game will have high stakes in the music, which is usually where you find the more acrobatic and adventurous kind of themes, right? So the first thing is that this more bass focused really gives this tune a lot more energy, which fits the vibe. And the first thing to point out is that the bass line has a lot of chromatic movement, which makes it almost bluesy, but the fact that it's super syncopated makes it feel a little bit more like a hype, funky duel. You know what I mean? The drums are also very syncopated, making them a huge feature of this theme compared to most of the other themes on this list that didn't even have drums. All right, so let's check out the intro of this theme, which is pretty simple, but it is super bass focused. So let me solo the bass and what the bass is doing in this intro. Right? So again, very syncopated, very short attack, very aggressive, right? If I go to my hands, so the first thing to notice is that we're in the key of E for sure, right? And this motif, it hits our minor third, fourth, hits this chromatic note, and then the flat 7. So this tells us that we're in E minor. I'm not sure if we're in, you know, like a typical Aeolian minor with the minor 6, or if we're in a Dorian, or even if we're in Phrygian. It's unclear at this point because they're not hitting any of the defining tones of either of those modes, right? So it's kind of open to being anything at this point, except for that chromatic note. So if I play this bass line again, notice the chromaticism that happens over the perfect fourth, right? Really giving it this like edgy character. Right? So this kind of chromatic movement gives it a little bit of edginess, you know what I mean? A little bit of funky going on. And if we bring in the drums, notice how syncopated everything is if I turn on the click. Notice how many accents are on the offbeats. A ton of syncopation going on. And that pretty much wraps up the intro. Very simple to bring it in. And let's go ahead and check out the verse section. Okay, so this is kind of the main theme. And the main melody is actually fairly simple, but catchy. All right, so I'm gonna play you the main melody as well as the counter melodies so you can hear what it sounds like, and then we'll break it down a little bit more as we go forward. All right, so let's go ahead and play this main melody. right? And then there's kind of a different second tail of that melody to lead us into the next section. All right, so we know that E is our root note, and this melody kind of starts on the flat 7, kind of making that bluesy, kind of cool minor sound. And then we're chromatically moving down to the 5th. Very strong move, and we're really emphasizing that minor 6 on a strong beat, which tells us that this is kind of like in E minor. So it's telling us that information now in the melody. But other than that, it's fairly simple. It's nothing crazy going on in the melody, but catchy enough that you can remember it. So it gets stuck in your head. Now, what becomes interesting is when we start to include these counter melodies and this other harmonic information that's coming up around the main melody, and pay attention to how it never, quote unquote, takes over the main melody, but always supports it. Again, the main focus is always the melody in most productions, and it's a very good composition move, arrangement move to make sure that your other parts aren't getting in the way of the main melody, but are either supporting it or doing some interesting counterpoint. So let's listen to the melody with both counterpoints and then break down a little bit what's going on. Right? So there's some interesting things going on here. The first one I want to point out is the more simple one, which sounds like this. Right? So very rhythmic, simple extra layer that is playing with this main melody. Let's check these out together. Right? Notice how when this extra melody, let's go the hands, plays this, that kind of half-step chromatic movement, it's matching the main melody, right? If we play these together. Right, so that's some really cool harmonizing going on for that specific point in time, really emphasizing those two notes. Dun, dun. And then it goes back to being separate where this counter melody is kind of doing its own rhythmic thing and then moving around the melody. So again, they're both emphasizing those punches, telling us that that's a little bit more important to pay attention to. And otherwise, it's just kind of keeping this upbeat rhythm going on, which is very Mega Man-esque to have some kind of high energy part. Now, if we turn off this counter melody and we go exploring the other one, what I got on the push here is that other counter melody. So let's listen to it. So some interesting chordal movement going on here around the melody. All right, so let's break down a little bit what this counter melody is doing, which is bringing in a lot more of the chordal information aside from the bass, right? So right away, let's start it off. Right, so right away, we're starting kind of with this E minor shape, right? Really bringing us at home and kind of doing this pentatonic, right? Pentatonic movement, just adding some extra energy, but really oscillating around this E minor chord to start it off. Right? And then there's a little fill that goes on when the melody and the counter melody are hitting those punches. So yeah, just keep in mind that for that part where the other melodies are doing those punches, we have this little motif just to help turn us around. Right? Just kind of hitting 4th, 7, root, kind of back down. So nothing crazy here, but just again, it breaks up the pattern it was doing to match the main motif of the main melody. Again, pointing towards how important matching the main melody and not getting in the way of it is. Okay, so let's continue. So for the second half of this kind of counter melody progression, right, we're starting off on this kind of B minor tonality, which you could see as the 5 chord in our E root note, right? And we're kind of emphasizing that minor 6 again. And then the second chords, we're actually doing this kind of emphasizing the C major shape, which is actually the 6th chord in E minor, right? So just coloring the harmony and adding some progression to this. So here's what it sounds like. Right? And then the last time we kind of do this, right? Emphasis on this kind of C major shape. All right, now, so if I bring everything together, keep in mind that aside from the main melody, the main focus is actually the active bass groove, okay, which we'll break down in just a sec. And then the added bonus is this extra counter melody and harmonic coloring kind of going around your head and locking in super tight with the bass and drum groove, okay? And notice towards the end of this passage how the main melody kind of breaks its pattern and leads the ear that we're going to some other kind of place in the music, okay? But before we go there, let's actually check out what's going on in the bass and the drums, since it's so drum and bass driven. All right, so here's what the bass is doing in the main section. It's a very active bass part, and I'll turn on the click so you can hear how syncopated it is from the main pulse. Right, so very kind of funky, right? Like very syncopated, offbeat. And again, introducing some chromatic movement between the flat 7, major 7, and the octave. And then if we bring in the drums on top of this, right, we can notice how syncopated it is with the drum beat. Right, and if I bring in those counter melodies now, notice how they all lock in super tight together with this drum and bass groove. So this is all of it together. Right, so notice how the bass, the drums, as well as this counter melody lock in super tight, but still don't get in the way of this main melody, right? So let's play these together. Bring in the melody. Right, and then we climax with the melody leading us to the next section, right? If I play just the melody. Next, let's move on to the chorus, and now we get some movement in the harmony, and check out these bass arpeggios. So really interesting movement going on, kind of all over the place. There's some interesting transitions, and that's kind of adding to the excitement. We're kind of building up to a climax here, right? And one thing to point out is now these call and response motifs kind of take over as center stage while the melody becomes very simple. And let me break that down for you is, right, we have all these different arpeggio events that are happening, right? Right, so notice how in this section, these kind of raging arpeggios kind of take over the main focus while the melody is still prominent. It kind of takes second stage in my opinion, right? So this is kind of what they sound like together. Okay, so we have some crazy stuff going on with these counter melodies while the main melody stays simple. So let's play it again. Then we go into the next section. Let's bring in the melody now. Right, so notice how the melody, still interesting, less catchy, but moving with all of these crazy arpeggios at the same time. All right, so let's break down a little bit what's happening with this bass motif. All right, so there's kind of four main riffs going on here. And again, we're in this kind of E minor sound. Right, so right away, we're starting off on this kind of 6 chord outlining a C major, right? And then as well on D major. So we're kind of moving the harmony to be centered around the 6 and 7 chord, right? Relation to E, we have our minor 6 and then our minor 7, right? Flat 6, flat 7. And then again, we repeat the same motif that was in the intro, basing it on the root note. And then we finally wrap it up with this interesting transition motif, right? So notice how the first riff here, right? Very much outlining a C kind of major shape. Moving on to the second one, right? Outlining a kind of D major shape. Moving on. Right? Again, the same motif that we had in the verse. So again, keeping that kind of familiarity a little bit. So again, introducing new chords on different scale degrees and then anchoring us back to that main motif. It sounds like this. And then we have this crazy transition going on. So notice with this little kind of final motif that we anchor on the minor second, as well as this tritone, right? The sharp 4, flat 5, however you want to look at it, which you could see as like, okay, we're maybe borrowing that motif from Locrian, like E Locrian, which is kind of out there. But for me, this is more just like a crazy chaotic transition riff, which would be akin to like progressive metal or progressive rock, where you're just adding in that chaos to really help illustrate the fact that you're in this crazy boss battle and you don't know what's going on, right? And then they, towards the end of the phrase, kind of bring it back down where we're emphasizing this minor third and this flat 7 before resolving back down to 1. So it kind of goes chaotic and then kind of brings it back home. In the second half of this kind of bass motif during the chorus, like the climax of this tune, again, we're starting on this flat 7, outlining this kind of major shape. Same with the flat 6. Then we move down to the 4, right? Which is a major sound if you're relating that back to E minor, which this E major key would have a 4 chord being A major, right? Instead of the A minor in E minor, right? So kind of borrowing that, kind of stepping outside what you would see as normal for E minor, right? Just to bring it home. And finally, the last sentence here. So we go here. Right? Then we just anchor on that root, right? Kind of bringing us in for the final tension to resolve back to our home base, right? Next, let's look at a few of the other arpeggios. So look at this counter melody. So one interesting thing here about this counter melody is that similar to the bass, it starts off emphasizing the C major 7 kind of shape, which is our flat 6 degree. But then when we move to the D major, right, it emphasizes this flat 7, giving it a dominant sound, right, which is interesting, right? It's kind of borrowing a chord because typically your flat 7 degree here in E minor would be a major sound. But they go ahead and throw in that flat 7 here, right? So let's check that out. And then finally, they move on to this E minor 7 shape, which is our home bass, our first chord, right? Our root note. And then back down to the dominant on the D. So the whole movement of this kind of counter melody is this major shape and then dominant shape back home to E minor and then back down to this dominant. So it's kind of this chromatic movement going up with these chords, right? Then we have this crazy run, sounds like this. So let's break that down a little bit. So although this run is fast, basically it's outlining an E minor 7 shape, right? So this kind of sound, and it's just kind of scaling up that same scale all the way up until the very end where we start to descend into chaos, right? Right, and then it's just towards the tail end of this crazy run that we kind of step outside of the kind of E minor tonal center, right? So we kind of got this. So we kind of have this motif going. Right, this crazy thing, and it's all inside the key of E minor, right? Except for when we step down into this F, where that would only be seen in maybe E Phrygian, right? Where we have E here, and we have that minor second, right? Or maybe E Locrian again. So similar to the bass movement, and it's only towards the tail end of this whole motif where we hit this minor second and really throw off the harmony a little bit, introduce a little bit of chaos where it's not diatonic, right? So altogether, just notice how at the very tail end of this whole thing, when we hit this F note and it kind of throws us off, right? Right? Just that one note that's bringing us outside the key center. Then the counter melody continues with this type of shape, so I'll play it. And then we have a crazy run at the end, throwing us into the turnaround. But let's break down these chords a little bit. So we're actually kind of outlining what I would say is like this D minor 7 flat 5, right? We're hitting this flat 5 and we're kind of going, again, borrowing that chord from somewhere else. Then we're kind of bringing it back to something diatonic, to the C major 7. And then we're going down here to this A minor 7, which is totally diatonic. And then we kind of have this, again, same theme, crazy run for the fourth chord. Let's break this down. Here's the D minor 7 flat 5. And then we move on to the C major. Then we move on to the A minor shape. And then the final chord that they outline in this shape, again, is the 5 chord, which is a similar move as earlier, which again signals us that we're maybe going to resolve back to the root, right? So we're outlining this kind of B major 7 shape, right? Right, as it goes down. Kind of outlining that kind of shape until we get to this crazy fast run, which would be fun to try and play on guitar. But then that crazy fast run is outlining that E minor pentatonic kind of vibe, which is the center and like the tonic of this whole piece. Right? So right from there, 5 chord into 1. Finally, let's look at the melody during this chorus part, which is actually a lot more simple than those crazy arpeggios, right? Again, I think those arpeggios are taking the lead, and then this melody's kind of taken back a step, but still kind of guiding our ear through all this. So if we visualize E as the root note, we can see that this melody is starting on the flat 3, then moving up to the perfect 4th, perfect 5th, hitting that minor 6th, right? So again, really telling us we're in E minor, okay? And going from there. Right? And again, similar to that counter melody, we have this crazy kind of chaotic descending motif that, again, towards the very end, goes slightly outside of the key, right? So this is very simple. This is all just inside of E minor. All right, and this is where it gets interesting, where we're kind of just descending down this E minor shape, right? Where we're just hitting, kind of moving down this E minor scale, but then notice how we're going towards the end, which we're hitting that minor second compared to our root note E. Right, then in the second half of this melody, notice how, again, here's our root note E, right? That we're kind of hitting this F, which is the minor second outside the key of E, but it's part of the main melody here. Right? Hitting that F. Then again, finishing off on that 5, creating that kind of tension before we resolve back to 1. All right, so that insanely fast run, as well as this kind of like chaotic twilight zone of harmony that kind of cascades us into the next section, brings us into this build up and turn around, which restarts the loop. And now the focus is on building up the tension to resolve it back to the start of the theme. And notice how active the bass is in terms of the melody, right? Plus super active syncopated drums really kick up the energy into overdrive. This is kind of getting into like progressive punk rock territory. Okay, so let's just play this whole transition as to when the harmonies and counter melodies gonna descend into chaos, crazy fast run, and then the bass comes in with faster drums to really amp up the energy, create that tension to resolve it back to the main melody. Right? So that brings us right back into the main melody. And this is pretty simple, but just notice how the rhythm, right, and the repetition of this bass motif that's super syncopated takes over, right? It's just like, okay, we're going for a ride. And then this is kind of making us, it's kind of projecting us forward into time, right? Right? Then we have this really cool harmony that goes on with this counter melody with the bass. Again, super syncopated if we throw on the click. Right? It's almost entirely syncopated and off the beat. And then it brings us back home into the main melody. Again, the counter melodies sound incredible, harmonizing with the bass, again, contributing to the build all the way to the final unison punches where everything's going boing, boing, back into the main melody. Let's move on to our fourth game, which is Sonic and Knuckles, released on October 18th, 1994. And there's actually an army of composers that contributed to the Sonic and Knuckles official soundtrack. And excuse me in advance for butchering their names, but Howard Drawson, Sachio Ogawa, Tasuyuki Miyada, and Jun Siu. I remember my best friend growing up had a badass set of emulators for literally every console at his house, and I felt like he broke the matrix with this crazy cheat code. Turns out his dad was a programmer, and Nicola now works at Game Freak in Tokyo. Crazy stuff. But growing up, he had access to all of the consoles, like you name it, SNES, NES, Genesis, anything and everything that you wanted, he had it. And one thing that we played a ton of was Sonic and Knuckles. And one thing I've always noticed about Sonic music is that it's very rock and roll, and it's usually the instrumentation and composition being akin to a rock band, pop punk band, funk band, and could probably be played by a band compared to a lot of the other themes that we explored. It would probably sound muddy, just like a muddy garbage mess if a band tried to play that. And so even though this is computer music, it really nods its influences towards a lot of rock and roll, right? And it might be because Sonic was trying to be more cool, you know, more edgy, more like for teenagers versus Nintendo was for kids when it came out, right? So let's go ahead and check out this theme. So I'll play you some of it and then we'll start breaking it down. So it sounds like this. And this is Mushroom Hill Zone, which is the first area, I believe, in the game where you're playing as Sonic and Knuckles. All right, so notice how this whole entire theme is essentially very syncopated, very swing oriented, right? Having a good time in the Mushroom Hill Zone, know what I'm saying? And yeah, we'll break it down, but essentially a huge emphasis of this is the funky feel, the moody feel, which we'll break down in just a sec. And basically there's like a driving bass line and swing and a lot of tiny riffs and embellishments around here, overall creating a good time to introduce yourself to Sonic and Knuckles, know what I'm saying? So let's kind of check out the intro. And one thing to point out is that in the intro, there's no kind of discernible beat, and the drums are kind of doing a call and response fill thing with the bass. And again, it's kind of like all off the wall, which creates a lot of tension before everything drops together. All right, so let's kind of break this down a little bit. Let's play it. right? And then we have this like chromatic descending line that brings us into the main section, which could be signaling the crashing of the death egg in Sonic, right? Something's crashing, and that's kind of the scene that you're playing in Mushroom Hill Zone. But the first thing to point out is that let's solo the bass here. So it kind of does these punches to bring us in, and then it goes into this kind of motif that it actually repeats for most of this tune. Okay, we'll break that down in just a sec. But the drums are kind of just doing this like call and response. And notice how there's like a triplet kick pattern here in the intro, right? Right here. Which kind of like creates that space and tension. It's kind of crazy. And then we have this descending chromatic line, right? Right, so this is what the chromatic line looks like. And it's super simple. It's basically just chromatically moving down and then, right? And it's just like something falling. So the first thing to point out about this main section is actually the swing in the drums, okay? So most music is going to be pretty much 4 on the floor, right? Where we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and the rhythm is matching that. So you notice that this groove, when I turn it on with the metronome, that it's kind of swinging around the main pulse, right? It's not on the nose. So it's kind of creating that swing and that push and pull, which kind of gives you like this Mushroom Hilly vibe, you know, strolling in the park vibe, right? So let's play that. Right, there's got like that swing into the drums. That's the first thing to point out. And the other thing I want to point out is that there's more than meets the eye to this tune. So it took me a while to actually figure this out. But like I was looking at the bass line, and it turns out that the bass line isn't that helpful when it comes to trying to find the chords of this tune, just because it's kind of doing this syncopated motif that's kind of in its own world. It's kind of doing its own thing, which is definitely funky when we listen to it with the bass, but it doesn't really signal us any distinguishable chord progression or straight up harmony, right? So it wasn't helpful, but let me actually show you what it sounds like to have the bass and the drums together, and we'll pull up the bass. Right, so it's basically this swung motif where, fun fact, there's actually a push and pull going on with the drum and the bass where they appear to be doing their own thing on the surface, but they're actually moving in lockstep. All right, so I have the drums and the bass brought up together here. Let's go ahead and solo them so we can see what's going on. So we can see that the drum beat is in orange, right? And we have the bass line in blue. And first thing I want to point out is these notes right here on the bass. Check out how syncopated they are from the drum groove, right? The drum groove is kind of swinging, but basically is just kick on the floor, right? Right, a little bit of swing in the hi-hat, but the kick is basically on the pulse. And then when I bring in the bass, notice that how syncopated this bass line is. Right, these 5 notes. Notice how none of them fall on the downbeat, right? They're all extremely syncopated, right? Falling completely off the groove of what the drums are doing. But then in the second half of this motif, notice how the bass and drums lock in, which kind of creates like a tension and release. There's a tension created by the bass and drums falling apart with the syncopation. And then the second half of this riff, they kind of sync up really tight, right? Right, so notice that whenever the bass goes to the da-na, da 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 da, it's linking up really tight with the drums. Right, a little bit of syncopation there, but again, those are all lining up very tightly while these ones are syncopated, right? I just wanted to point that out because that's a real big factor in creating this swing, syncopated, funky vibe. All right, so there's a few things I want to point out about the harmony of this tune, which is a little bit interesting, right? Because it took me a while to actually find this out and to figure this out. But in my perspective, like this tune is still in kind of the key of B flat major, right? So we got B flat, and if we play that out, right, that's kind of the tonality. So it's still uplifting, it's still joyful and happy, but there's some interesting things going on here. First of all, is that in the melody, and I'll show you this in action in just a sec, you can see that the cadence that we see in the melody and also the bass line is that we're kind of signaling towards a flat 6, flat 7 into major 1 cadence, which is very much the Mario Bros cadence, right? If you think about the Mario Bros main theme, right at the end, so this Mario Bros cadence is very popular. It's basically borrowing the 6 chord and the 7 chord from the minor key universe and applying it to the major key world, right? So if we look at like B flat major, right? Our 4 chord would be major, 5 chord major, back 1, right? And our 6 and 7 chord, right? Our 6 chord in a major key is going to be minor, right? It's going to be built on this degree, right? So we're going to have our minor 6, and then our 7th degree is actually going to be diminished back home, right? So if we look at B flat minor instead, right? Well, our 6 chord is actually major, 7 chord is also major, resolving back down to minor 1, right? Or another way, if we go up an octave, right? That is very much one of the most popular cadences in a minor key. Now, in this song, this is where it gets interesting. We're borrowing the kind of first half of that cadence, but then we're resolving to major, right? So you can hear that in the melody. All right, so I'll go ahead and play those chords at the right time underneath the melody, and you'll see what I mean by hearing that cadence. Right? So again, flat 6, flat 7 borrowed from the parallel minor key into the 1, right? So let's go ahead and play it. Right? So now we're starting to get an understanding to this harmony. The next thing I want to look at is the main melody. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and solo the main melody and let you see it, and then we'll break it down. There's a few sneaky things happening in this melody which make it amazing. Okay, so this is what makes this melody so awesome. We're kind of starting with this B flat major chord, flat 6 borrowed from B flat minor, flat 7 borrowed from B flat minor as well, and then going back home to the 1 chord, right, which is minor. And this melody starts off, which is all in B flat major, all good. But then when we're going to this flat 6 chord into the flat 7 chord, we're hitting that minor 3, right? That definitely flat 3 in the melody until we resolve back to 1 and hit that major 3rd once again. So we're playing around with introducing the minor 3rd and the major 3rd in the main melody, which kind of gives it this like darker edge. Instead of just being super happy all the time, there's kind of these sad, moments in the main melody. So if we look at what the bass line is doing, it's essentially doing something like this. Over and over again. And what's interesting about this is that we're actually building this kind of G major shape, right? To start off this motif, and then going to the root, which is our B flat, right? So it's interesting that we're kind of building that chord off the 6th degree, right? A major chord, which would be normally minor, right? So again, playing around with potentially, you could see this as modal interchange. It kind of gives it like a Mixolydian flavor, in my opinion. And this creates some tension going on with what's happening in the harmony, because it's not a one-to-one ratio, right? There's some interesting relationships being built between this repeating bass motif and then the interesting cadence in the harmony that kind of creates this tension where it's like, you're not really sure like where the harmony is going, but you know, it's kind of this funky stumbling thing that's moving you forward. And again, playing with the borrowing chords from the parallel minor key, as well as liberal use of bringing in that minor third and resolving to the major third, creates this darker edge, happy experience. But it's like, oh, there's something funky here, like mushrooms. All right, moving on to the next section here. If we play this main melody into the transition section, right, we can see that the final motif of the melody gets repeated a couple times. So that's what's keeping it familiar. And you'll notice that the bass clearly starts to show us that cadence I showed you of the flat 6, flat 7 into the major 1 is emphasized very clearly here by the bass, right? So let's go ahead and play that. Right, so first thing to notice is that in this first half of the melody, right, if I go back to my hands and let's go to the piano, right, in the first half of this transition, it's going, making sure not to hit that major third like we saw, and then the second time, it brings it in, right? So just that small detail of leaving out the major third and emphasizing the minor third gives it a little bit of a darker resolve in that one riff of the melody, right? When we listen to this, right? It's kind of like a little bit more moody and minor versus this one. Very happy, right? Because then we're hitting that major third. So just a couple cool moves going on in terms of, you know, voice leading and what tones you're introducing into the melody. If I go to my hands again, the bass is just hitting the during this transition section. And then finally, during this bridge section, right, the melody, again, has some secrets in store for us that makes this part feel a little bit melancholic, where it's like, it's kind of sad. And it's like, you know what I mean? I kind of want a resolving back to sunshine and mushrooms, you know what I'm saying? So let's listen to this melody. Right, and then there's a cool harmony going on with this counterpoint as well, which we'll look at. So this kind of bridge section has some interesting things in store from this main melody, right? So we're starting off with, which fits nicely in our B flat major tonality, but then notice that we kind of do this minor chord descending, which is actually a B flat minor kind of chord in the melody, right? And then the bass is playing something else. But I just want to point out that there's this minor shape that's resolving to the 1 minor in this melody, which kind of gives it a downer feel, right? Right? And then we're clearly accentuating the and making sure not to hit that major third, right? So again, keeping it kind of a darker tonality. And if we look back here, notice that the accompaniment has a very cool harmony that it plays during this section. So you can see that with that harmony, right, we're kind of hitting the flat 6, flat 7 back to the root in B flat minor, right? So again, the melody and the harmony are displaying everything screaming minor key, right? So we're kind of, you could see it as almost borrowing the 1 chord from the parallel minor, but the melody goes something like underneath, right? Which is a very cool harmony. And then this song is very sneaky in the way that it wraps right back around to the beginning of the loop. So I'll play it from here and it just falls right back into the intro once again, where the drums and the bass are kind of spaced out. They're doing a call and response. And then we have that bass motif and then that cascading chromatic thing, right? All right, let's move on to our 5th and final game, which is near and dear to my heart. It is Pokemon Red and Blue, released September 28th, 1998. And the music was composed by composer Junichi Masuda. Okay, and there are a few video game melodies more burned into the collective gamer consciousness than the battle themes from the original Pokemon games for Game Boy. I remember my grandma gifting me a teal Game Boy Color with Pokemon Blue, and it was game over. I was totally hooked. I then got Pokemon merch, Pokemon posters, Pokemon cards, stuffed animal, watched the show, the whole 9 yards. And for some reason, I still know all the moves and stats for the first 150 Pokemon. Now, there's no chiptune music, in my opinion, that displays the unique features and strengths of chiptune other than the Pokemon battle themes. They're all great, and there's 4 different ones in red and blue. There's the wild Pokemon battle, there's a trainer battle, there's a gym leader battle, and then there's the champion battle. Okay, once you get to the end of the Elite Four, right? But for this video, let's go ahead and check out the trainer theme. But I'd encourage you to check them all out since they all share similar features that make them sound inevitably and undeniably like Pokemon battle music. All right, so I have it loaded here, and let's give it a quick listen so we can remember what this theme sounds like, and let me know in the comments down below if this brings up some nostalgia for you. It definitely does for me. And we'll give it a taste, and then we'll break it down. All right, so hopefully you remember that tune. Anytime you bump into somebody who's also training Pokemon, you probably destroy them because you over-leveled up your Pokemon, and they have like 3 Caterpies in the beginning, which is really dumb. But yes, this is the music that plays in the background of that event. Now, if we look at the intro, we have this kind of chromatic descending passage, which again, I want to emphasize that this, if it would be played by any organic instrument or like in a band or something, this would most likely sound like a muddled mess. And the reason this works with chiptune is because the raw waveforms, in this case, we're listening to a grand piano, but on the Game Boy, we're listening to like square waves, triangle waves, etc. And since they're using raw waveforms like that, they can be digitally bound to a fairly restricted frequency range, okay? And because of this, you can get away with playing things that would probably sound muddy in non-computer based music, right? Like with organic instruments, this would be very tough unless you have like some crazy distortion and you're shredding on guitar, or you have like a distorted synth or something. But even then, it probably won't cut through as much as if it was just a raw wave. All right, so let's zoom in on this intro a little bit. Essentially, it's just chromatic movement where if you look at the shape of this melody, I'll solo it, it sounds like this. Right, we're kind of anchoring at this note right here, the A in the high register, and then we're simply kind of doing this shape over and over, these trills, going down chromatically, right? So there's something anchoring us at the same level, but then we're kind of chromatically moving up and then resolving up to this, right? So it kind of creates this inevitable, like, oh my God, like it's taking your attention, you're about to start a battle, and then it resolves. And you'll notice this same type of thing with every single theme in this game, whether it's a wild Pokemon, a gym leader, or even the champion. There's some sort of similar theme that brings in the tune like this. If we go to the bass, this is what it sounds like. And you'll notice that this is literally just staircasing us down in chromatic movement in groups of 4, right, in 16th notes, just bringing this in. So nothing crazy going on here, just chromatic madness, but a little bit more stability with the melody compared to the wild Pokemon theme, right? But again, just chromatic stuff bringing us down. And some of the foundational elements that you'll see in this Pokemon battle theme are the same for all the Pokemon themes, the battle themes, right? And this is kind of what they usually incorporate is the use of pervasive chromatic movement, right? So there's a lot of chromaticism in these themes. They also emphasize the interval of the fifth being used as harmonic grounding with the bass, most likely, and you'll see that in just a sec, where we're doing root fifth movement a lot. And then we also have the signature syncopated rhythmic pattern that just screams Pokemon. And if you think of the original theme, like da 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 da, right, that rhythmic pattern, you'll see that pattern again in this theme and all the battle themes of this game. And another thing to notice is that there's no drums because Game Boy wasn't capable of it. So often the use of fast chromatic lines create a sense of rhythm since they didn't have like a typical drum kit or kick drum or whatever it may be to keep time. If you listen to the Wild Pokemon battle theme, you'll notice that the Trainer battle theme has a lot of similar elements, but one noticeable difference is that there's a stronger sense of melody in this one, which I thought would be more fun to cover. All right, so let's talk about the intro a little bit. All right, I'll play it for you. All right, so in this intro, we're just creating a ton of tension, right? It's like, okay, we don't know what's going on. It's a battle, right? There's a lot of stakes at hand. And the first thing to point out is this meandering bass line and the repeating motif that's kind of bringing us up in pitch. So that creates a lot of tension. And so let's kind of check out what's going on with the bass here. All right, so this bass shape is oscillating around what you could see as this B Locrian vibe, right? Because we have this flat 2 and we have the tritone, right? So it's definitely very unsettling, very rare to see this as the home base for a piece of music. Keep in mind that it's only temporary for the intro in this piece, but nonetheless, we're kind of anchoring around this Locrian vibe, which is a lot more chromatic, very tension with this flat 2 and that tritone. If we look at the melody in this section, it's very simple, but it's very strong in its sense of rhythm, right? It's always repeating the same rhythm. And again, it's emphasizing this tritone, right? So again, creating a lot of tension. That's what it sounds like. Right, then we go up an octave at the end. As well as the end, we bring in a harmony. It sounds like this. And a little bit of chromatic movement here, right? To just match the element that's going to be coming here. So again, this is all just building up towards the main theme. Another few things to point out about this intro section is that this walking bass line definitely emphasizes a lot of fifths. Okay, so it's highlighting again that theme of a root and fifth as it's kind of playing. And the main melody here is extremely syncopated. So if I solo this, put on the click, right? Right, for the exception of the downbeats, every other note in the melody, right, except for this downbeat, all these other notes are landing on a syncopated rhythm, right? All right, next let's move on to this main theme. All right, I'll play from here. Then it goes into the next section. And the first thing to notice here is that the chromatic line that comes in with this counter melody, okay, acts like a call and response to the main melody, creating that sense of contrast, right? So if we start out at the beginning here, we have this main melody. Very simple. But then in response to that melody, we have this crazy chromatic run. Right? Which is simply just moving up and down chromatically in a fun way to create that sense of movement. And the other thing to notice here is that in this section, we have clear harmony that starts to happen. We start in B minor, then we move to C sus4, going back to B minor, and then going to A major. Okay, so if we look at the chords that are happening during this main theme, right, we're starting off on B minor here, right? So notice how the intro of this tune was in this B diminished voicing, and then once we get to the main section, we move to B minor, which is a lot more harmonically sound, right? So again, that Locrian kind of vibe was only for the intro. Now we're moving to more of a B minor, kind of vibe. But again, this is where we kind of get a curveball right away when we move on to C sus4, right? So again, just root fifth on C and then adding that 4 in the higher voicing, which creates like an open voicing, but coming from the B minor creates a lot of tension. So this kind of adds a curveball where we're starting on a minor chord and then we're moving to this sus, right? This sus4 kind of voicing based on root C, which is a half a step higher than the B minor, right? So again, that could be signaling Locrian or Phrygian, but again, it's outside of B minor for sure, right? So we're getting a curveball right away. Then we go back to B, and then we go down to this A major. And we can see this A major down here as the 7 chord of B minor, right? So here's our B minor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Built on here, there's our A major chord. Okay, so there's some interesting chordal stuff going on in this theme, which is pointing towards being in B minor, but there's definitely that curveball happening with this C sus4. Now, if we think about the wild Pokemon theme, and I encourage you to check it out, I'll link it below in the description, it has 3 states. It simply has home state, tension state, and then release state. But once the trainers get involved, it kind of opens up the Pokemon to a whole new world of defined harmony, or you could see it as like refined combat, where in the wild you have these Pokemon, they don't really know how to fight. They kind of fight naturally, I guess. And then in Pokemon battles, the trainers are training them to fight and battle each other, right? All right, so if we examine the parts in this main theme a little bit closer, right? The base is very simple, right? Which, let's check it out. Let's go the overhead. Right, so again, just hitting this root fifth motion across those chords we outlined, back down to A, and then we bring in the flat 6 here, right? So very simple with some fills in between, but again, it's holding down the harmony for this tune. If we now look at the melody and the counter melody together, I think that this is what really makes this theme jump out, right? Let's listen to them together. Notice how the main melody still is what's stuck in your head, right? This guy. Like, this is definitely what we remember. But notice how this counter melody adds in some interest, some syncopation, that counter melody kind of to the main melody, but doesn't take away from our ability to remember it or perceive it. Right? It's supporting it the whole way through, but just adding some interesting extra notes and color around that main melody. And then it goes into the crazy chromatic passage, right? Right? Again, some rhythmic counterpoint going on as the melody holds that long note, which is a great move. A good thing to know is that whenever you're composing your song, try to always make room for the main melody and don't get in the way. But when the main melody is either doing nothing, like over here, or sustaining a note, you have some freedom to now introduce other elements to be the focal point before the main melody continues. Right? We have these cool runs, again, that are happening when the melody is not. And then it goes into the next section. Now, this whole next section is essentially a giant chromatic build up to the main climax, right? So if we play it, right? So there's just crazy chromatic runs the whole time, which is creating a lot of tension, right? And the melody is actually very simple. If we play it with the bass, chromatic, chromatic again, then we have a whole step, right? So if we look at the bass, you can see how the movement goes. Right, so we're essentially just going up chromatically to build up to this point of climax. So let's play it from here. Right, so this is a high point of energy of climax of the whole theme. And let's check out what's going on here. The melody is very simple again, very simple. Right, notice how these are the same motif, rhythmically, but ending the last voice at a different place, right? Signaling us a little bit of movement there, and then just these sustained notes. Right, so again, just really simple, long-winded melody, letting the counter melody and the bass create this tension. Right, because those two are locked in really tight rhythmically all the way from the beginning. Right, and then this half-step movement bringing us in. Then we move into theme B, which is much stronger harmonically, with the harmonic middle voice repeating a 3-note pattern in that same 3-3-2 rhythm that we found in other Pokemon themes, right? But the keys here is that now the middle voice has a lot more harmonic function versus here it's just like these crazy chromatic lines, right? So what this creates is that in this theme it feels a lot more harmonious and stable compared to earlier, right? So let me play it. Right, and then we get to the final turnaround. But notice the difference between this theme and this one. And one thing to point out is that this theme B, although it has a different melody, it's very much using the same motif, right? If I play this from here, right? Different notes, but the vibe is very similar to the main theme over here. Right? Very similar motif. Right? And then from here, we kind of have this counter melody coming in, right? Creating these arpeggios, coloring the harmony a lot more. Right, so if we look at what the counter melody is doing, it's very simple. It's just going back and forth between an A minor and this kind of B flat major. Right, adding a lot of extra color to this section. Final thing to point out with this section is that the bass is a lot more spacious, okay? There's so many less notes compared to the whole rest of the tune, right? So it's creating that sense of openness because the bass is essentially just playing nothing most of the time. Just hitting these punches, syncopated. Right, but that really opens it up for these other elements, right? This extra harmony that we have here, the main melody, these arpeggios, to have room to breathe, right? And then all of this is leading towards this kind of buildup. Right, so all of this is again starting to reintroduce some tension before we get to another peak, but this time of tension, right? It's not really a climax. It's like, oh my God, a lot of stuff's going on. Are my Pokemon going to die? crazy stuff, right? But basically, super simple. Right, so it's just going. Right, so it's moving between these kind of familiar tones that we had in the beginning, right? But anchoring us to this B flat instead, right? And then we have the melody that's essentially outlining those tones. Right, just leading the ear into this final point of tension, and climax sounds like this. Right, and then we get to the final part, but this part's just hilarious. It's very heavy, right? Where if we listen to the rhythm of the bass, I'll solo it with the click. So notice how it flips and flops between landing on the downbeat and then emphasizing the offbeat, right? On the downbeat, offbeat, downbeat, on the offbeat, right? So it creates a lot more like, whoa, where are we? And then we have these crazy just stabs coming from the main melody here. Right, some diminished chords going on in there. Right, so these little stabs actually have some interesting stuff going on. We start off with this B flat tritone, right? Just real dissonant. Then we resolve it a little bit to the A with this perfect fifth, right? Then we go down here to this F major 7, right? Very nice. And then this diminished over G kind of vibe, right? So interesting movement, but notice how this tone stays consistent throughout the whole time. And then finally, we kind of have this different variation on the theme to bring us home and loop around this whole theme, right? And again, the bass is just doing this chromatic movement, which you might have noticed in this video is very common in all of these video game themes, especially for the boss fights, this chromatic movement, or even if you're trying to get something funky or a little bit of creating tension with chromatic movement, like it is super common. And right here, if we look at the bass, it's super simply just walking up a chromatic line, right? And then doing this fill, resolving us back to B, right? And if we look at the melodies now, right? So notice how it starts us off easy, very simple, and at the end, it simplifies to really bring us into the next section. And one thing to notice about these little motifs is like they're the same thing, but just getting slightly more textured in terms of the notes and moving up chromatically, right? So we start off here, we have one extra note here, and then here we actually dip down below and resolve up to the last note. So just slight variations to keep it fun, but also all pointing towards the sense of climax we're building chromatically, right? And then we have this counter melody as well, with some kind of counter riff going on. These sound really cool together. There's the chromatic movement again. Chromatic movement once again. And then finally, chromatic movement to bring us home. And then this loops around into the main theme once again, which is right here. So if I loop this whole section, we'll just select all this and play from here so we can resolve it into the beginning. and the battle ensues. There you have it. There is 5 epic video game themes. We broke it down. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Let me know in the comments down below if you did. If you like this type of video, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want more transmissions from the Metamind music vibes. You know what I'm saying? And I just got to say that a lot of these composers are truly geniuses at what they do, and they're so lesser well known than classical composers or famous artists, right? But they definitely have some genius composition skills, interesting harmony. And if you think about it, the thing that's really cool about video game music is that they develop themes and music relative to situations in the game, right? So like, for example, if we think back to the Mario Castle theme, like this is the first time in the game where you're not, you know, like strutting around on this island and with the sun shining and you're riding a dinosaur and you go into this crazy castle with like these skeletons and all this stuff going on. And you're like, what the heck? So it has to be that context where it has to have shock value. It has to draw you in and create that uncertainty to create that contrast in the adventure. And it's the same exact thing for music, in my opinion, where a great song or a great piece of music or even a great body of work, whether it's an album or the music for a soundtrack or video game, is that it has that tension and release in the narrative within the music itself, as well as between the songs, where if you have like a very uplifting adventure starter vibe, which is like the starting of the hero's journey, inevitably there will be something that creates tension in the narrative, right? Which moves the piece forward, which creates engagement. It sucks you in, right? Creates that contrast, all of that great stuff. So I just have to tip my hat to all of these amazing composers that we checked out today, and I hope you do as well. If you like this type of video and breaking down themes and learning more about music theory, as well as composition to help you continue to level up your skills as an artist, a musician, a producer, and even an engineer, I invite you to join my free school community where we do stuff like this on a weekly basis. There's live Q&A where we can just hang out and talk music. And there's a bunch of courses for my streamlined workflow system to help you finish more music faster. There's mixing stuff. There's going to be music theory lessons and courses. I have some other people who are experts in that field bringing in. So just come on down, join the community if you like the vibes, and I'd love to see you in there. And with that said, I will see you in the next video.